is not democratic in that sense. Why should the masses have the right to decide whose fatwa is correct? So the best one can do in contemporary circumstances is to look at those people who have an authorization to teach and whose doctrine and adherence to the classical law seems to be more or less intact. Whether or not they're popular is something else. And very often those muftis and religious leaders are under intolerable pressure from the regimes. The argument over the mufti of Egypt is, for instance, the current separation wall between Sinai and the Gaza Strip, that the only way in which the Gazans can get any sort of supplies, building materials, many medicines, etc., is through the tunnels that go underneath the fence, because the Israelis have barricaded the points of access to Israel. And now the Egyptian government, with the US subsidy, is building an underground wall 18 meters deep, that whole length, 100 miles along the boundary between the Gaza Strip and Sinai, to stop Arabs helping other Arabs so that the Israeli siege can be perfect. And it's the Americans who are pressing that because they want to destroy Hamas. Has the Mufti of Egypt spoken out? Actually, I would like him to, but he's under gigantic pressure. And the view of people like that would be, if we don't sometimes hold our peace, then the government will just appoint somebody who's even worse. It was the same with the so-called Red Muftis in the Soviet Union. Baba Khanov in Bukhara, who appeared at Red Square and celebrated Marx's birthday and did all of those apparently haram things. I've been there and spoken to his family, and they said, well, if he hadn't done that, there wouldn't have been any mosques in existence at all. We just did what was mumkin, what was possible in our situation. So it's very easy from our situation to moralize about religious leaders in effectively totalitarian states, but we should, I think, often give them the benefit of the doubt that they're faced with extremely difficult choices, and that some of their fatwas may represent arm twisting by the regimes rather than what they actually believe to be right. And their judgment is presumably in the hands of God.
And we as individuals, who should we follow? What's your recommendations?
One should follow people who are properly, traditionally accredited, who have ijazah, who are authorized to teach by people who are themselves authorized, in a chain that stretches back to the authors of the original texts. And you can still find people like that. Generally, those people don't have much to do with the regimes, and don't have much to do with the various radical movements either. Their perception is that the problems of the Muslim world are too profound for there to be a merely political resolution. There has to be a transformation of souls, which can only come about with quiet grassroots religious transformation away from the limelight. That's what I've always found to be the case. You go to any Muslim city, and there is the official religious hierarchy, and they've done their deal, and inshallah they're sincere. There's also large numbers of scholars who have nothing to do with officialdom, have nothing to do with the radicals, but are just keeping the tradition alive, and they'll give you fatwas and responses if you ask them, but you have to work quite hard to find them.
Okay. And the gentleman in the red t-shirt.
I've also got two questions, but the main thing is I've learned a lot about Islam. What if there's an essence to Islam, what that essence has to say about violence, and it sounds wonderful. But I think what a lot of non-Muslims are interested in, well, I don't know about Muslims too, but what I'm interested in also is, it seems that's not the only question, what the kind of construction of Islam says. It's also what is happening in societies that call themselves Muslim, or in communities that call themselves Muslim, and to what extent is rhetoric lifted from key Muslim texts being used to educate people towards violence or intolerance or forced or using violence to try and spread Islam. So I wondered if you could say something about that. And the other, which is related question, was about jurisdiction in non-Muslim states. So is that hierarchy of who is qualified to tell you what to do even harder to find? For instance, in Britain, who are Muslims supposed to follow?
Yeah, well, that's good. Two good questions. I don't have a totally satisfying answer to either. I guess in the first case, one would point to the fact that the Islamic rules of peace and war are only applicable if there is a leadership that is constituted according to the rules of the traditional Sharia. And that hasn't really existed since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There's various strange hybridized models. So you have Colonel Gaddafi with his weird vision of some sort of Leninist Islam. I don't know how you categorize it. Certainly post-classical. You have the Saudi monarchical model, where the city of Mecca now looks like Las Vegas, but without the gambling, and somehow they think that's how a holy city has to be, and the lifestyle of the princes. You have the Iranian Republican gangster, semi-educated elite with the Republican guards beating up people in the streets and probably fiddling with elections. That doesn't really look like a sincere religious movement that's interested in serving the people. Where does it exist? There are some cases where religiously motivated political activists have assumed positions of political power, generally under the radar of most observers in the West, where there have been forces for relative good. And you could look at Indonesia, for instance, the world's most populous Muslim country, where the West supported to the hilt Sukarno and Suharto, and then Suharto was replaced by basically a religious groundswell of opposition. And it was led by the Nahdlatul Ulama, which has 40 million members, headed by Abdurrahman Wahid, who's a Cairo-educated traditional religious scholar, who replaced the Western-dominated totalitarian system with a democratic system which was not perfect, but far better in terms of freedom, human rights, economic development, openness. They withdrew from East Timor. They've cut some kind of civilized deal in Aceh. So that would be an example of somebody who's a passionate religious leader. He died, of course, just a few weeks ago. Somebody who's an absolutely authentic, traditionally trained Muslim scholar, but doesn't figure on the West's radar as a religious leader because he's not shouting and throwing bombs. But he's infinitely more influential than most of these clowns that you see now in the Middle East. Turkey might be another example, despite the difficulty of doing anything in the sort of militant, secular, constitutional framework in Turkey. Erdogan's government, which is religiously driven, all of those politicians have wives with little headscarves, and they're sincere practicing Muslims. They have brought something far better to Turkey than the sort of ostensively secular regimes that Turkey has had since the 1920s. So there are plenty of stupid and dreadful things happening politically in the Islamic world, but there are some very interesting and impressive things happening as well that generally don't get enough credit, I think, in the Western press. There's some interesting books. They have them in the UL, actually. Douglas Ramage has a book on religious political movements in Indonesia and the role of Abdurrahman Wahid in creating an Islamically authentic, as he understood it, democratic alternative to Suharto's autocracy.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question.
Your other question, I also wanted to have a go at that. How do Muslims, if Muslims are confused, understandably, given the sort of broken, malfunctioning relics of tradition in their own societies, what do they do if they're in a minority situation? Well, you can ask people and you'll get different responses from them. It's often difficult, but often what happens is that they will identify themselves with a particular body of scholarship associated with a college or an institution of learning. That tends to be, as with the Jewish context, which doesn't have priests, but it has teachers, rabbis. They're grounded in colleges. And the big Islamic colleges in the north of England have deans and rectors and heads who tend to be authority figures for the majority of traditionally oriented British Muslims. But of course, if you are alienated from them and you sort of surf around and you get Shaykh Google, as it's called, to sort of guide you to fatwas, then unfortunately you can find any point of view that you want. And and it's not just Islam that's malfunctioning in that way. There's similar problems in Christianity. The boom movements in Christianity around the world are sometimes off-the-wall Pentecostal Baptist movements, and the mainline churches are kind of greying. And Hinduism as well is experiencing a crisis. You have these Hindutva, Hindu nationalist movements that are politically very powerful, that do seem very strange in the light of the actually rather Irenic and externally tolerant values of traditional Hinduism.